Thanks, everybody, for joining me. I'm Adrienne Braganza Tacke. I'm a senior developer advocate at Cisco, and I'm here to talk to you today about something that's really, really difficult. Who here has heard this quote before? There are only two really hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. Yep. Well, we're going to talk about one of those things, and that is naming things. Naming things seems so difficult, so important, and yet we still can't get it right. And so this talk is really going to focus on that. Why is naming important? Why is it difficult? And what are the 3 C's of great variables? Finally, we'll go through some variables. We'll go through different types of variables and see how we can improve them and actually give you some guidelines on how to get them a little bit better to meaningful. So why is naming important? Naming is a way of placing order on our world. It helps us differentiate between the many different things that we have and interact with and see and use. And so this is super important for us to make sense of our world. For example, people just like naming things, like this cat. This is my cat, and when I got her, I had the choice to name her, right? I want to double check why this is a little iffy. A little better. That was driving me nuts. Sometimes we have to think about what we're going to name things, like my cat. So when I did get her and adopted her, there were many options to choose from when we are naming things like a cat. For example, there is the option Oreo, right? Because it's black and white, and you want to infer those characteristics of an Oreo being black and white to this cat. Maybe you like desserts as much as I do, and so you want to name your cat something, things that you like, or things that match those attributes. There's also Domino, which is a pretty popular name for a tuxedo cat. There's also Tux itself, because it is a tuxedo cat, and it's a little bit more formal, a little bit more common. And there's also onyx, which is a mineral that has similar qualities to the coat of this cat. I ended up going with onyx because it was a little bit more unique, and it was not as common as some of the other names for the tuxedo cats. And I just like that it's a little bit different, and that's the name that I ended up choosing. It's also very similar with my own name. I asked my mom how she decided to choose my name, and it was a very sad, funny story. I asked her, what is the process by which you chose my name? And this is not a joke. She went through the department store. She found a designer tag, like a clothing designer, and that's how I ended up getting my name, Adrienne Vittadini. So I'm really happy she didn't choose something else that I would not have liked. I actually ended up growing to like my name. I share with you these 2 examples because even though these are things that mean something to us, they are very limited in scope. They may not be universally understood, and they're really more gut-feeling choices when it comes to naming. When we want to name things, we should try to look towards other scientists. We are computer scientists after all, right? The way scientists name things are super, super strict and super, super specific. They have scientific nomenclature, and with that, they have a very specific set of rules that they follow so that they prevent confusion when they're talking to each other. This has been the standard so that any scientist universally can understand what organism they're talking about or what specific thing they're talking about. The more specific they are, the more likely they are to understand each other. For example, in this room, is there anyone here named Michael or Mike? The thing is, there are a bunch of Michaels in the world, right? So if all of those Michaels were in this room and I just yelled Mike or Michael, all of them would look at me and I wouldn't know, or they wouldn't know, who I was referring to. We would need some sort of additional modifier to say, am I speaking about this specific Michael or am I talking about this specific Michael? So that's one way why specificity is really, really important when it comes to making sense of our world. This wasn't always the case. Back in the 1700s, we did not have this naming convention for scientists. In fact, back then, it's just kind of how it was with my cat and my name. It was a gut feeling and what was recorded at the time. So for example, if somebody were to show this tree around or report on this tree or write about it in a book or a journal, one person could say, oh, this is a white oak. And yet another person could say this is a rounded oak. And still another person can say this is a rough oak. And the thing is, this is a white oak, but because all these different people consider it different things, it's really hard to get onto the same page and actually believe what they are talking about is this specific tree, which is in fact a white oak. To make it even more difficult, let's say they completely misattributed a different tree and called that a white oak. So this one is actually not a white oak, it is possibly maple. But that problem still stands, that if somebody else were to call something else some other identifier, that now adds to the confusion of what different things might be called. But in the 1700s, Carl Linnaeus, who was a Swedish naturalist, solved this problem. He developed a unique naming system by which we name every single organism. This is how we get super specific on every single thing and know we are only talking about a very specific thing through this naming system, and that's the binomial name. So every organism in the world is assigned a unique binomial name. Binomial meaning two. We can thank Carl for that. Binomial name meaning two, he developed this idea of a genus and a species modifier. So for the genus, there's Homo, and for the species modifier, that is sapiens, which is us, the humans, right? Very similar, but not specifically close to the analogy of the first name and last name I mentioned earlier. Genus could be Michael, whereas we have a set of or collection of things that might be similar, all the Michaels in the room. And then in order to really talk about a specific one, we added the species modifier or added a last name to know that I'm specifically talking about a specific Michael. So keeping this in mind, this is obviously very, very specific, and they're lucky to have such a precise naming system. But in between these two spectrums, we can kind of find where it best fits for variable naming, because variable naming, although we would like to get to this very specific notion, is going to be very hard in the context of programming. So why is it difficult? Why is choosing a name so darn hard in programming? Well, I will tell you the several reasons why it is. First, guidance on naming is mostly syntactical. When you look up any guidance on how to do variable naming, you only get syntactical things, meaning how does the variable look like? You get rules on casing, so things like use snake case or Pascal case or camel case or don't use kebab case. Or you get things like length, right? How long should the variable be? Should they be super, super long and very, very verbose, or the ones that we really should not be using are the really short ones, the abbreviated ones, the ones that only make sense to you but nobody else, the things that don't make sense and make functions or methods really, really hard to understand. With these kinds of guides, we get rules like this. We get rules like avoid kebab case since it clashes with subtraction syntax. We get use camel case for variable names. We get use short identifier names for short scopes, or keep the name length to a 25 character maximum. Now, these are all rules that they're not bad. They do help in getting a better variable name, but they all, again, go to the fact of the syntactical part of variable names, meaning how they look. When it comes to the semantics of variable names, the meaning of the actual names of the variables that we choose, it's a little bit, there's not so much. Sure. Should I switch out with this one? All right, and I'll turn that off, because that was driving me nuts as well. I'm sure it was driving you nuts. Thank you so much. So when we look at these so much better, it's like HD. So when we look at semantic guidelines for variable names, we really can't find too much of it. It all very much focuses on the syntactical guidelines out there. And so that's part of why I chose to create this talk. When we get semantic guidelines, if we find any at all out there, we get things like Use meaningful, descriptive names, or try making identifiers self-documenting, or names should be non-ambiguous. And while we kind of understand that, we kind of get what that means, even these identifiers themselves, these are also really hard. Like, what do you mean by that? How do you actually choose a name that is meaningful? How do I know my variable name is descriptive? How do I know it's non-ambiguous? So even having these are not enough. And to make matters even more difficult, names have to be correct. Correct meaning when someone chooses one variable name and someone doesn't agree with it or thinks it's not a good name, it doesn't convey what it is, that notion of that variable name being correct for that scope is also highly debatable. So not only do we have to choose names that are meaningful, descriptive, non-ambiguous, but they also have to be correct. And that means the whole team has to agree that they understand it to be the concept that you're trying to convey. So all of this now, adding into it, which is all pretty anecdotal and what we may have experienced now, we add onto this other layer of complication. There are words that are homonyms, meaning same words with different meanings. And there's two categories of those type of words. The first are homographs, which means they are the same spelling but different meaning. And we have homophones, which are the same pronunciation but different meanings. So if we take a look at what that might look like, for example, in English, the word duck. I took my pet duck to the Gucci store, right? Or duck your head while going down the stairs. Or the word rock. There was a great rock band last night. Or you could be talking about solid rock. Almost 4 tons of solid rock had to be removed. Same writing, but different meaning. Homophones, on the other hand, we have things that are sounding the same, but are completely different as well. We have in English, again, right? Turn right at the next intersection, or write a book, they said. Or hour and hour, you're with me here for the hour, and what do you mean, hour cake? All of these things add into the additional comprehension that we must do when we are reading variable names. And not only that, but when we choose variable names, they make it much more difficult for us to pinpoint exactly what concept we are trying to convey. So homographs, same spelling, different meaning. Homophones, same pronunciation, different meaning. Now, this gets even better when you consider that not everyone's first language is English, or that everyone speaks more languages than just English. So for example, in Danish, you have the same things for homonyms. You have skull and skull, which could either mean bowl or cheers, and you have another one, jul, which could mean wheel or Christmas. And for Tagalog, which is one of the languages I speak, you could also say tayo, which means to stand, or tayo, which means we, and basa, which means wet, or basa, which means to read. Now, while these might not exactly line up with some of the English words that we may use in programming, one thing to consider is that if we start to abbreviate words, or we start to chop up words and combine different words and concepts, some of those might actually align and might be confusing with some other words that are outside of the English language. And then we get to synonyms. That's just homonyms. We get to synonyms, which are different words with the same meaning. So if we take a look at one word, let's say the word count, which is the name that we're going to choose as a variable name. There's a name that we want to choose, and then there's a concept, an associated meaning with that particular name that we've chosen. There's a perception tied to that name. For example, count is something that's very common in programming. We probably have it in several names, variable names that we've chosen. But if we chose the name count, there's the concept associated of summation. There's the concept associated of enumeration of numbers. And then there could also be the synonym of tally. Maybe you don't want to use the word count. Maybe you want to use the word tally. For tally, there are concepts of keeping count and to mark associated with that particular name, but there's also a cross-reference there of concept, right? Tally could also refer to summation. So just seeing the amount of concepts that are tied to different names, you can see all the different concepts that we now have to put into our head when we are choosing a name, and as well as when we are reading these variable names. We now have these additional cognitive load in our head head that says we're thinking about summation, we're thinking about the enumeration of numbers, we're thinking about all these different things when really we want to focus as much as possible on a single concept as much as possible. So this is not just me. This has been stated in a paper, and it still holds true today, even though it was written in 2006. This was focused on concise and consistent naming. And what they found was that this, in fact, is the case. Synonyms and homonyms make it really difficult for us developers to choose names in programming. In computer programs, homonyms, the first part that we talked about, pose a really hard problem for not only program comprehension, but for all of us to take into account all the elements of C when spotting an identifier named N. So for example, if we chose the name N1, count, like in the earlier example, we would have to take into account both concepts that are associated to count. Similarly, synonyms unnecessarily increase the domain that we are having to keep in our heads. So as we've spoken of before, the more words and more concepts that are associated together, the more we have to associate in our heads, either when choosing a name or when reading and comprehending a variable name. And the last part, we really want to get to this. This is what they propose in their paper, is that if we could somehow get to a single name to convey a single concept, that's probably the closest that we can get to a very good variable name, because that means there's less misinterpretation, there are less concepts that we are misconstruing. We are just saying this name means exactly this thing. That's really hard. In a different paper, when they asked 334 developers to choose 47 variable names, the median probability that two chose the same was just 6.9%. So keep all of that in mind, the homonyms, the synonyms, the fact that people might not have English as their only language or first language, and all of the difficulties of choosing these names. This is likely why we get this result. So, to the actual thing that you may have probably come here for. How do we choose better variable names? How do I give you semantic guidance on what better variable names are? And before I get into all of the different examples, I just want to preface this by saying these are conventions that I've used on my own teams, and these are conventions that you should talk about with your own teams. They are pretty good because they get to a clearer variable name, and if you all agree, which is the most important thing on your team, if you all agree to use these conventions and agree that these are the clearest way to choose variable names, then that makes your code base more consistent and more maintainable, and all the variable names you choose afterwards can follow these conventions. So you can choose to use them or not, but get aligned with your team first. So the 3 C's of great naming. They need to be consistent, they need to be concise, they need to be correct. If the variable names that you choose can fall within or achieve these 3 characteristics, you likely have a very good variable name. So what does consistent mean in this case? That means the identifier, or the variable name that you choose, needs to be unique enough to convey the concept. As proposed in that paper that I showed you, if we can get to a single name only relating to a single concept, that's a pretty consistent identifier or name that you've chosen. It needs to be concise. If the identifier can be, or if the identifier can accurately convey the concept and minimize the related concept space as much as possible, we consider that concise. So in the example I gave where I said count could mean enumeration or could mean the tallying or the count of numbers, that has too many concepts associated with it. If you can find an identifier name, either by combining names or combining other more singular concepts to make sure they only link to a single one and really reduce the amount of different concepts that are associated, that's again another good characteristic to have of a variable name, a good one. And finally, they need to be correct. So they need to convey what's actually being assigned. There was a different study that was done where the biggest frustration that developers had was that when reading through code and they found variable names that were returning things that were not actually what they were. So imagine the cognitive load of assuming something, let's say, was a collection of products when actually it was returning a collection of users. So they need to be correct. They need to actually give back or actually be assigned to what it's trying to convey. So variables, keeping the 3 C's in mind and keeping in mind that we want to get as close as possible to a single concept per variable name that we choose. Here are some guidelines that we can go through. For example, Booleans. Booleans can only be one of 2 values, true or false, typically, right? So for Booleans, what I have found to be the best naming convention is that Booleans are something, they do something, or they have something. If a Boolean is something, you could have things like is an upgrade, or is approval, or is pro member. If it is something that you are checking for, that is one way to name your Booleans. If it does something, let's say it allows white space, or it has finished updating, or it did restart, or it matched a pattern, if it's doing something and that's what you're checking, that's another way to kind of name or frame your Boolean. And if you're checking that it has something, the prefix of has is a really good way to name your Boolean as well. So has more than one morning, has multiple discounts, has exception, etc. So if we had to return the condition of return true if at least one user is active, what variable name would we choose? So we're literally finding the something in this particular code snippet. What would we name this Boolean if we wanted it to return true if at least one user is active? So first, there was this try, is users active? And if you read this, you're like, doesn't feel right, right? Not only is it grammatically incorrect, it's not correct. That's not a good name, so we're gonna skip that one. Next, there was another try where someone tried to rename it to go, is at least one user active? That's very precise, that's very unique, it's correct, it's technically correct, but there is also this art of if you can find something that's a bit more concise and uses less characters, that's also a good thing too. So while this one is technically correct, we're going to skip on it for now because it's a little too wordy. I think we can do a little bit better. Is one user active? Alarm bells should be ringing right now if you are seeing this. And that's because that is a lie, right? Is one user active? Yes, you could interpret it as that, right? If you had that context right now that we all have right now, that I said we wanted to return true if at least one user is active, you might initially think that's a proper name. Is one user active? But the problem is if you yourself come back to this a month later or somebody else reads this, anyone reads this, someone else might interpret this as there's exactly one user active right now, and that's wrong. So for that, I'm out, right? I feel like a shark. For that, we're not going to go with this particular variable name. There was another try, which was, is some user active? And that's okay. It kind of aligns with the array.sum prototype, but I think the one more retry and one more refactor of this particular variable name, we end up with, is any user active? This one is pretty consistent. This captures the notion of having at least one user active. There's no room for misinterpretation that there's only one user active, and it will return the correct condition. So for this case, we'll choose this. There is another option as well. One person brought up to me in another conference that the option has active users is also another name. So again, this is not the correct answer, it's not the only answer, but it does mark off the 3 C's. It's consistent, it's concise, it's clear. So this is just to go to show you that there are multiple ways to get to a correct variable name, especially if your entire team agrees, understands it, and agrees that it's a good name. So integers, these are things that are typically understood to be numbers, and they can be counts or numbers of something. So for variable names that are integers, you can have the integer itself. Some things intrinsically denote that they are an integer, right? So age, year, the maximum allowed login attempts, tooltip delay in milliseconds. These are great examples of what that variable is. It's very concise, and sometimes you don't need to add any other modifiers to make it that much more unique, unless you're in a very specific concept space. One thing I want to point out, tooltip delay in milliseconds. Some people argued that this was way too long. Why do you need to add in milliseconds in there? Why don't you just write tooltip delay? And I want to say that why would you want to add additional mental load on your head? We already get paid to do so much, right? We are writing code, we are reviewing code, we're making estimates that are complete lies, but we're going to try to make the estimates, right? We're doing so much already that when we're doing the actual coding, when we're reading or writing code, why make it harder on ourselves to find that additional piece of information when we can just put it right into the variable name itself? The next guideline, that's a number of something. So number of retries, number of descendants, number of accounts, number of days without rain. This is just very clear. You know it's a number, you know it's not a collection. And even, let's say you're using a statically typed language where you can declare the type of the variable. Sometimes people will say, well, if you can tell that it's an integer, you don't have to add number of. But try that for a second. Let's say you have just retries or days without rain or accounts, maybe not days without rain, but descendants or accounts. You could misread that and assume that that's a collection or a list. By adding number of to that, you very quickly know that it's a number. It's, again, cutting and shortening that mental load that you have to add onto yourself, and you quickly recognize that this is a number. Similar for something count, maybe you have a failure count or a retry count or a current cake inventory count. It all points back to the same thing. It's something consistent. It's very clear what it is, that this is specifically an integer, and it is correct. It's bringing back a number for you to use. So another one. Let's say we needed to return a number of eligible discount items that are part of a customer's order. And we start with this, which I have seen this in real life. So, number of eligible items within transaction. It's very verbose. It's very unique for sure. It's very accurate. But it's very wordy. We can cut that down much, much shorter. So let's say that we remove the within. We just shortened it to in, right? That's already saving us a couple characters. But we still are getting too many things in here. We still think we can cut this down to be more concise. So, number of eligible items. We know we're in the context of a transaction, and we can remove that part of the variable name. Removing that doesn't take away that part of the domain that we're trying to work within, and so it's okay to remove that and make it shorter. And the one thing I forgot to say here is we could have stopped here, but there is the notion of different types of eligible items in this particular domain. So while there are items that could be discount items, eligible for discount items, this variable name doesn't take into account, say, eligible items for free shipping or eligible items for award points, or eligible items for any other number of things you may be keeping track of. So while this one technically was okay when we cut it down from the second variable name, it now loses the particular part of the domain. And so we need to add that part back. We need to add a different modifier to make it unique enough that we understand what exactly this is that we're talking about. And so that's how we get to number of eligible discount items. Now again, someone argued, remove number of, because we don't need the number of, but I will still hearken on you to say when you're in the middle of reading code, you're in the weeds, and you're really just trying to solve a problem or get something done, very clearly knowing that this is not a collection or a list and knowing that this is a number helps immensely. It gets you to understand things faster, and it also gets your teammates or anyone else who's going to read this code later on much faster. It's very clear, it's very straightforward that this is a number and not a collection or list. So we'll go with this one. For floating point numbers, these are unrounded measures or numbers that are not integers. And again, we can use the floating point itself because there are things that are intrinsically we understand as likely to be a floating point number. So there's height, there's weight, there's price in Danish krone, there's angle in degrees, there's high temperature in Fahrenheit. Again, we want to get as unique as possible and as concise as possible with what we are describing. In a similar fashion, we can do something amount. So let's say we have a discount amount or a transfer amount or a refund amount. Amount is a very clear indicator that this is not just an integer. It could be, but it is not just an integer, that it is more likely to be a floating point. We add the discount or transfer or refund modifier to make it more unique and to know that it is a floating point number of some sort. And then we get to strings. So these are the labels that we all know and love that are typically very difficult to name, but we're trying to get better at that. So it's typically a sequence of characters. And again, there's the entity itself, right? We have full given name, we have city, we have short speaker biography or player selected class or definition. And depending on the context that we are in, we can have something as short as city. City could be enough. It could be a concise, consistent, and clear and correct name, depending on the context it's in. If this is in a class that's, talking about an address, maybe you don't need to have a longer or more unique name. City is going to do the job. But if you are not within something that has that context, then maybe you have a name like full given name, or you're using that particular variable in a different way, which means you need to be more concise and more descriptive about what that variable is holding. So full given name is a better name for that particular piece of information. Sometimes you also need to know the implementation, sometimes. And so when you need to know that, sometimes you can use something as string, whatever that thing is. So you can use month as string or time zone as string. This is very common, let's say, when you're using libraries that help you with dates and times, or you're manipulating some timestamps, and on the other side, you need to show it as a string on the front end. Sometimes you need to use this particular naming convention because, again, it's making it easier on yourself that when you're reading it in this particular context, you're working with it as a string, something that may not be typically used as a string, but in this case, you are working with it as a string. So the naming convention as a string makes that known. For collections, which are arrays, lists, sets, groups of things, there are, again, really, please use the plural form of the thing. It makes it so much easier to read, and it's a very clear indicator that it is a plural amount of that thing. It's a list or a set or an array. So for example, robots, sentient robots, discounted products, customers, newly released books. Typically, when we have the plural form of again, it's a clear indication that it is a collection of things and that it is holding a group. It could be one at the moment, but the intent of the entire thing is that it is a group or collection of things. And then again, sometimes you need to know the implementation of the collection. For example, maybe while you are working with something, you need to know that this is an unordered list of customers, or sometimes you need to know that it is an ordered set of timestamps. If it makes sense and if it is clearer while you are working either through the logic of a function or you're going through something a little bit more complicated and understanding that part of it makes sense to know, then adding it to the variable name, again, makes it easier for us, takes a little bit of that cognitive load and off of our heads and makes the comprehension that much easier. For maps, accessing values by keys. So for this particular way to name these things, I like to use the convention of the key to the value map. So for example, book ID to author map, or customer to order total map, or product ID to suppliers map. And you could argue that you could leave out the map if you wanted to, but this is my personal preference, I like to add that the map is there because it is, again, just that much clearer to know that it is a map that I am working with, and these are the particular ways that I'm accessing these items in the map. And finally, there are pairs and tuples. So these are items that are typically stored together, and they're not always, but they're usually items of the same type. So for pairs, the convention first pair and second pair is a really good naming convention. For example, you can use length and width, or sets and repetitions, current and lifetime XP, or genus and species. Whenever there is a pair, it is always nice to know that they belong together using and it's also really clear to see that it is a pair because you're saving them together in this particular way. For tuples, which are typically three things, it's the same kind of convention, first, second, and third thing. So for example, height, width, and depth in centimeters, or saturated, trans, and total fat in grams. It's another way, again, a clear way to show that this is now a tuple because you're saving it in this particular manner. And it is a great way to combine the unique aspect of what you are saving here. So height, width, and depth in centimeters. Somebody asked me, so what do you do if you have multiple items, right? What if you have more than three? Do you do first and second and third and fourth and fifth? Say no, that in that case you use a collection or a list or an array. We kind of stop at the tuple because it's already getting pretty long there, and anything longer than that you would typically want to store in something like a collection. In the end, what I want you to understand is that great code is understood. When we choose a variable name, we want it to immediately convey what it is that we're trying to show. The concept that we are wanting others to understand, if that can be understood in the first reading, rather than it having to be interpreted, meaning you got to Google something, you got to ask your colleague, what does this mean? If you're confused and rereading it over and over, if you are finding it hard to understand the rest of the logic, if you get stuck there because the variable name doesn't make sense, those are all characteristics of variable names that might be worth taking a look at and seeing if you can rename in a better way. Ultimately, great code is understood, great code is maintainable, great code is readable. And by readable, great code is readable by humans. If you can remember just that part from this particular talk, then I think you'll be able to start naming your variable names much, much better. So salamat, that means thank you in Tagalog. I'm sure I have lots of time for questions. We'll check out the Discord, but that's me. If you have any questions, head over to that Discord or come find me down here. And thank you so much for listening about variable naming.
The double negatives, like in Booleans, like how do we feel about those types of situations?
Typically, the question was, how do we feel about double negatives and Booleans? And that is, we want to try to stay away from them. If you notice, the guiding conventions that I've had are all typically positive. It's is this, has this, does this. That typically helps to have the readability not have a double negative. Sometimes you do get to names where you have to check something like that. So sometimes one way to kind of get around that is to make sure that the negative part is not at the start of the variable name. But otherwise, if you can actually name it to not have a double negative, then that would be much better for readability.
Okay, we prefer to avoid those.
Yes,
Yeah.
we avoid double negatives. Thanks for the question. Sure.
So you had a preference to using number of to refer to integers. Is there a reason you differentiate with number of versus something like count or length?
That's a great question. Sometimes it depends on the domain that you're working with, and it depends on how you are writing out the logic. There's an echo. I'm going to back up here. So sometimes it depends on the concepts that you're trying to convey. Sometimes number of just works better with what you're trying to say. Sometimes count works better with what you're trying to say. I don't have a preference for one or other. Mostly if it makes sense in the context that you're using, you can use one or the other. So off the top of my head, I cannot think of an example where one would be better, but use the one that makes more sense and is more readable and understandable. But both work well to convey that it's a number. Sure.
Yeah, you talked about a lot of different data types, but I didn't catch it if you did. But did you talk about naming like instantiated objects?
No, I have not. I think not going through that specifically, I did not do that because I feel like some instantiated objects could fall within some of the same ones. So for example, strings might probably be the closest one associated to that. So you could follow the same guidelines for strings with those, but no, I didn't go through those specifically.
Okay, yeah. How do you feel about like naming your objects the same name as their type?
Ooh, that's a good question. Naming objects the same name as their type. It depends. It depends. Again, I think the ultimate goal is clarity and readability. So if adding the type or naming it the same as the type adds to the clarity rather than bundles it up and jumbles it up, and you go, again, similar to the double negative, but you're going, okay, I'm reading this, then I would err against that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is all awesome stuff. I agree with a lot of what you
Want to echo?
talked about. But how do we go about kind of implementing this in a team setting, right? So building a document and then without sounding like pedantic and like nitpicky. Because in PRs and stuff, like I could, if I wanted to, write a whole bunch of comments and say, I don't like the name of this, I don't like the name of this. But if there's maybe a document, maybe you have a practice of doing that.
I'm glad you asked that question. The question was, how do you go about actually starting out with your team or talking about agreeing to this or having some sort of document to abide by these guidelines and set up what those initial guidelines are for variable naming? I'm actually writing a book on code reviews, and I go through this. But one thing that I mentioned there is something called a team working agreement. And a team working agreement, it's kind of borrowed from Agile, Scrum, but we've co-opted it here in engineering, but it works. And these are for all the things that are implicit, meaning all the things, all the people on our team, we kind of feel like everybody else knows. We're like, of course you would know that naming a Boolean without a double negative is something that you should do, right? You feel like everybody knows that on your team. But if you just feel that and you don't explicitly write that out somewhere, it's never going to be enforced. And a lot of team members are going to be disappointed because they're going to go, why would you name it that, So one thing to do for that is have a team working agreement, which does involve talking to your team. Go through and maybe go through some of these conventions or go through your code base and say, where have we been having trouble and where have we been having the most debate when it comes to naming? And then try to find a convention that everybody can agree on. That can be easier said than done, but if you do find some guidelines to start off with, you could put that into a team working agreement or a team standards guide, a team conventions guide, and that's the one that you can start enforcing as you go through and work on that code. As you find other examples, like in PRs or pull requests or in code reviews, and you find other names that might work better, those could be examples to even add to your team working agreement that says, here's a convention that we would like to start using now because it's made so much more sense.
Right. Do you happen to have like any template maybe to start off one of those kind of documents?
Yes, in my book. I promise I'm not trying to shill here. This talk is about variable naming, but yeah, please come find me. But yes, I do have a template to start off, how you would start off discussions with your team, how often you might do it, how you could get everybody's opinion or feedback and how you can try to formulate the initial team working agreement. And the thing about this too is that it's not like a thing that once you've decided it, that's law, right? This is meant to evolve with your team. If you find something is not working or you find something else that fits better with your team, you change the team working agreement. The only caveat is that everybody has to be on board and everyone has to be aware that this change is being made. But the more that you can collaborate on items like this, important things like this, like team naming conventions or team formatting standards, style guides. These, again, are all the things that are kind of implicit, that can be subjective, that can be highly debatable, but the more that you talk about it and the more that you get it out into the open and actually have a standard that everyone agrees to, the more likely you can get it enforced and have it be consistent for the most part. But yes, I do have a template. Come find me. Sure. All right. Thank you so much.